Welcome everybody to the 45th talk in the series organised by the University of Buckingham called Great Minds or Great Lives or Virtual Fireside Talks. When the conditions allowed, I'd have a whole series of wonderful people like Philippe Sands coming and talking to students and staff and local community in the sitting room around the fire here at the Ondaatje Hall, and we're carrying those on virtually now. If you're new to this series, a very warm welcome to you, and do have questions ready. If you're not on Teams and can't see how to ask a question, then send the question to Matt, who is our technician, and just make a note of this address. I'm sure he'll put it up on the screen also. Matthew.Thompson with a P at buckingham.ac.uk. Short questions are preferred, please, and also put your name, and then I'll put them to Philippe either at the beginning or soon after. And if you enjoy the series, do pass them on. They're attracting 3,000-4,000 people a night, which is about the size of the Albert Hall. So great pleasure and honour, Philippe, to have you here with us as our guest. If you were speaking at the Albert Hall, we couldn't see the room that you are in. And just tell us where you are, and is this where you do your writing and thinking?
I'm in France. Firstly, it's lovely to be with you, Anthony, and thanks to Buckingham. It's terrific to be here. I'm in France. I'm in a small village in the Luberon called Bonnieux, where actually I do a lot of my writing, and I'm in the room in which I wrote much of the Ratline book, I think, which we're going to talk about a little bit tonight. And outside of my window, you can't quite see it. I daren't turn my laptop around. I have probably one of the most beautiful views in the world. I'm looking over the Mont Ventoux, clouds in the valley, blue sky above. It's pretty extraordinary. And I'm very fortunate to be away from much of the difficulties, I'd say, of the current situation with COVID and other things. So I'm in a very special and lucky space.
And so here are the two particular books of the 17 that you've written. We're going to be talking about tonight. That is East West Street. I don't know if I don't know whether that's readable. And this is the Ratline. And I was given one by a son and Adam, and another by another friend. So wonderful books. And let's just begin, Philippe, by understanding more about why did you become a lawyer? You were at Corpus Christi, Cambridge. Do you not regret studying history or English or history of art or French? Why did you study law, and why did you then go into law?
Terrible mistake to study law as an undergraduate, in my view. I did it by accident. I started off studying economics, but I'd had such a fabulous teacher at school, Edmund Burke, believe it or not, was his name, a Yorkshireman.
Marvellous.
I know. And when we were 15, he took us down a coal mine in Yorkshire, and it was one of the formative experiences of my life. I didn't know, living in sort of London, quite how many people lived. It was very, very testing. Anyway, he taught me economics and politics, and I got in to do economics. But in fact, he'd done such a great job in teaching us that after a month, I realized the course had been done better at school and we'd covered everything. So I switched to law, sort of a mistake, except in my second year, I came across another Yorkshireman who became a teacher of mine of international, Robbie Jennings, who went on to be the British judge at the World Court. And here finally was a class that I loved. I stayed on, I did a master's, and I found an area of law, which of course, curiously, is very much in the news today as we speak, namely international law. And that was it. I was up and running. And my mentor was a man when I did my master's, and then subsequently when I was a research fellow at St Catherine's in Cambridge, Elie Louterpact, the son of probably the greatest international lawyer of the 20th century, Hirsch Louterpact, who is a character in East West Street. And then I was up and running and I never looked back.
We'll hear a lot about Lauter Pact coming up here. And just a quick comment, can't resist, on the British government. And surely it doesn't matter. By the way, can I also say that several colleagues from our law department will be watching tonight, and can I say I'm a huge fan of law as a subject, obviously, but also at university, but I do obviously understand where you're coming from there, Philippe, with that comment. But the position today, surely the government, with the marvellous Brexit policy that it has in mind, it doesn't really matter if it ducks and weaves a bit about international law, does it?
Well, let me just say something for the wonderful law faculty. I'm a professor at UCL law faculty. I happen not to teach undergraduate, I teach graduate. I sort of think the Americans, the Canadians and the Australians have got it right. And I do hope that in due course Britain will move to law, which is a vital thing to study, but as a graduate course, because I think the function of a university is not to prepare you for professional practice as a lawyer, but to make you think. And yes, I wish I had done history or literature or some other thing, but I'm a very happy lawyer. Yes, international law does matter. And in fact, you've read East West Street, you will know that in 1945, Hartley Shawcross opened for the British government at the Nuremberg Tribunal and began with a paean as to why the world was about to change. And we were going to move to a rules-based system. And that rules-based system was premised on respect for the rule of law. And Britain was and has been at the forefront of that for 75 years. And this is the first time in those 75 years that a British government has said, in these terms, we don't give a hoot about international law, we're going to violate it. And it's a shocking day. It's a shocking day for the bar, it's a shocking day for judges, lawyers, law professors, and it frankly trashes Britain's reputation internationally. And I feel incredibly sad about it. Boris Johnson negotiated the withdrawal agreement. He signed it. It has been ratified. It is in force. And for a British government to say we don't care about our treaty obligations means, in effect, that for anyone it is in negotiations with now on these future free trade agreements, you're negotiating with a partner which accords itself the right to violate what it is negotiating. That is not a good position to be in.
We'll come back to the strength of that sentiment and the relevance to what happened from 1933 onwards in the course of this talk, but that explains your passion for international law. Can you say how you came to write this book, which was not just a publishing sensation? This is East West Street, by the way, probably hard to read, but not just a publishing sensation, but a literary sensation. The way that you wrote this book with the most meticulous reverence for archives and hunting down stories. It's part detective story, as every great history is, and finding oral testimony as well as documentary and photographic evidence. And indeed, you pepper the book with illustrations. Again, you probably can't see this, but that's just would be a typical page in the book, with so many illustrations in it, which is unusual, but I think is a wonderful thing to do. So how did you, Philippe, get into this writing this book and then the Ratline?
Sure. Well, just on the photos, I should say, I mean, I do draw from others, and in particular, someone you will have read, W.G. Sebald, who I think was the first to really use that technique. And I've had some complaints by people about the quality of the photographs. They're too small, they're too indistinct, they're too grainy. And of course, that is Sebaldian, and that is for a purpose. It causes the reader to imagine, to look very closely. And that's part of, I think, the function of the photograph. It helps open up the imagination for the period. And we'll talk about that a little more. So it was 2010. I'd written various academic books, which I'm deeply proud of, legal academic books. And then in 2005, I published a first book which went beyond pure academic, non-academic publisher Penguin, a book called Lawless World, which essentially looked at the legal issues in relation to Iraq. And I really enjoyed touching an audience that was a very intelligent public. It's one of the things I've come to have a real reverence for. There are extraordinary smart people out there, readers who can really deal with these levels of complexity and who then connect with you. One thing led to another. In 2010, I was doing cases on genocide and crimes against humanity in The Hague as a barrister, which I work also as a barrister, and I got an invitation from an obscure place called Lviv in Ukraine. Would I come to the law faculty and give a lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide? Sure, I said, not because I particularly wanted to give a lecture, but it turned out that my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born in that city when it was called Lemberg, Lvov, in 1904, and I just thought it'd be really interesting to go and see if I could find my grandfather's house. I went with my mum, I went with my son, I went with my aunt, and one thing led to another, in particular the discovery that the city was the home, unbelievably, of the two men who invented those concepts.
It's just the most wonderful story on so many levels. I just want to say a quick word about Iraq. That's where I first came across you seriously, your work on the legality of what happened. And many people looking at this might have seen, I think, what's a wonderful series, documentary called Once Upon a Time in Iraq. Is that the right title of the series? Have you seen that, Philippe?
No. You know what? It's funny. My son Leo, who works for the BBC, has just mentioned it to us. And what was interesting was he said, Mum, Dad, he said, he's 25, and he said, you know, you've been wittering on about Iraq for years, and I've never known why you care so much about it. I watched this documentary, he said, which you just mentioned, and I now totally understand why this is seared in your consciousness.
That's very moving. So just a quick word there about the Blair government riding, just won a general election in 2001. Then there was 9/11. Tomorrow night, by the way, we have Angie Hunter, who was by Tony Blair's side throughout the 11th of September, which is tomorrow, and she'll be talking tomorrow evening about that day. But what did Blair do wrong in Iraq? What else could he have done, and how significant were the crimes?
The crimes were very significant. It's called the crime of aggression, and as you know, a very senior Foreign Office lawyer resigned over it.
Elizabeth Wilmshurst.
Elizabeth Wilmshurst, that's right. And I mean, there's no support in the international law community for the argument of legality because there was no authorization by the Security Council, which was the justification. And that, you know, there really is no support for that argument. So it was illegal. You know, Mr. Blair had his reasons. It's still not clear why he wanted to cozy up to Mr. Bush, but he did. And I think he should have done what Harold Wilson did in 1965 when he said to Lyndon Johnson, no, I'm not joining you in this enterprise called the Vietnam War. And I think it's deeply regrettable because I think that Mr. Blair has actually done many things that were extremely good and extremely important. And in many respects, I miss him and I miss his qualities and his intelligence. And I think all he needed to do was at some point say, you know what, with the benefit of hindsight, I got this wrong. And I think people would forgive him, but for some reason, he's not willing to do that. And I regret that because I think he would have more of a role to play.
I've argued the same thing repeatedly in the press. I cannot understand why he doesn't just admit what is entirely obvious, which is that he got it wrong under the pressure, intolerable pressure. And the ongoing damage to international law from what happened from 2003 in Iraq, but also the damage to the country and to Syria. What flowed from those actions that began in March 2003?
Well, you've described the documentary. I mean, horrendous in Iraq. And Harold Walker, the former British ambassador, in November 2002 gave evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee on Foreign Affairs, and he said this is what will happen, and the government will take over in Iraq, which will align with Iran, and you'll see the mess you're going to get into, which is, of course, exactly what happened. The consequences have been very significant. For example, there was at that point, and thanks to the work of Tony Blair in Kosovo, I actually supported his position on Kosovo, a growing move towards something called responsibility to protect, the use of force to protect fundamental human rights, where there's going to be a massive and systematic violation. That just died after Iraq. It killed off that initiative. I think even more significantly, what it did is I think it killed off trust in Britain, in government, because people no longer trusted public authorities. I think we paid a very big price for that when David Cameron called the referendum on Brexit. And I think when history comes to be written, I think the link between Iraq and Brexit is very close. It's essentially the loss of trust in leadership. And you now look at where we are in relation to Britain and COVID and Brexit, and it's not a happy, a very unfortunate, not a happy situation. So I think the consequences have been absolutely dramatic.
Let's come back now to your lecture in 2010, the memories that sparked up. A quick question, you mentioned Sebald there. Did Austerlitz affect you in terms of your own framing, your own writing?
Oh, I think he was definitely one of the influences. I mean, he writes so extraordinarily precisely and evocatively. There's a way as you read Sebald that your imagination opens up. You feel yourself in the room or in the building or next to the ocean. And I think in part I wanted a very stripped down, unemotional style, influenced actually probably most by a writer called Stefan Zweig. And for those who are watching who are interested in this period, the book that I recommend the most when I'm doing events and to my students is an extraordinary book published in 1942 called The World of Yesterday, after Zweig had committed suicide, which looks back at the 1930s. And I think it's a book that's very significant for our moment today, because some people think we are in that sort of 1930s type of moment. History, of course, as you know better than anyone, does not repeat itself, but there are some lessons we can draw from, and plainly something big is going on now. The tectonic plates, Blair would have called them, but with nationalism and populism and the decline of the rule of law and institutions, something is going on which is at least akin to that period.
Agree. Let's take the first slide, the first image, please. And can you tell us about this? Because this, if the right one comes up, Matt, will be where you finish East-West Street.
Yes, it's you're looking at a black and white photograph of a small wood about 25 kilometers from Lvov-Lemberg, about a kilometer from the center of a small town called Zhulkiev. This is the end of East-West Street, literally the path that leads from the town center. And you go a little bit further along this wood and you come to an opening, and at the opening there are two huge sand pits filled with water and lilies and reeds and other things. And in that sand pit on a day in March 1943, the 25th, 3,000 human beings were executed on a single day because of their religion. Amongst them were members of my grandfather Leon's family and the family of Hirsch Lauterpacht. And I end East-West Street at this place, a place, if you like, to reflect and look back. Remarkably, that my teacher's family found themselves in the same spot as my grandfather's family. The photograph taken by a very dear friend, a wonderful photographer, Diana Matar. You may well have read her husband's book, Hisham Matar's book called The Return. He's been a very big influence on me also. And this photograph for me is very evocative of what happens when things go terribly wrong. The sandy path that you can see is the very one along which 3,000 people walked in the last hour of their life. And so I think it touches me very deeply.
So you finish the epilogue by saying among the bones that lay beneath was a commingling, and you talk about that, and then you say the sun warmed the water, the trees lifted me upward and away from the reeds towards an indigo sky. Right there, for a brief moment, I understood. What did you understand?
That's a reference to an inner debate that I had in the writing of the book. Was I with Lauterpacht or Lemkin? Lauterpacht posited the idea that international law needed to protect human beings by giving all human beings individual rights, minimum standards of protection. It's a sort of modern system of human rights. Lemkin had another idea. His idea was, no, you must protect the group. In order to protect the individual, you must protect the group. And that battle between crimes against humanity, the individual, and genocide, the group, is at the heart of East-West Street. Intellectually, I was and am with Lauterpacht on the protection of the individual. I'm nervous about group identity and where it leads to. But standing at that mass grave, because all the bodies are still there today, I understood what Lemkin was up to, because my grandfather's family was there and there was a sense of connection that was overwhelmingly powerful. In other words, the head and the heart come into conflict, and at that moment, the heart took over.
Matt, can you just take that slide back, please? And do we, 75 years after the end of the war exactly, do we understand more about why the Jews were singled out for the treatment that they received?
I mean, I've come to the view, having immersed myself, it's just one view, I'm not a historian, that there was no plan in 1933 to exterminate hundreds of thousands or millions of people. It was that one thing led to another. Lines were crossed, and a certain inevitability then emerged. You know, we'll put them in a place, or we'll move them, then we'll go beyond moving them, and we'll try to kill them and scare them away, and then we'll kill them all. And I think one thing led to another, and that is a big theme in the Ratline, which homes in on a single story we'll come to with the next photograph. But I think that the logic of mass murder was the consequence of decisions taken earlier on. And that's what makes me very nervous today when I hear certain political leaders in the West, including in Britain and the United States, countries which led the world in that 1945 moment in creating another vision, evoke language of them and us, which is the starting point for where this kind of language can lead to.
And thank you for that. And do you agree with Steven Pinker that despite the Holocaust, despite what happened in Darfur, what happened in so many places in Cambodia, elsewhere, that humankind is more civilized, that we are becoming kinder to each other?
Well, I'm happy to accept that some of mankind is more civilized, but I spent 25 years of my life going around spots of the world where horrors happen. I mean, right now, I'm deeply involved in the case involving the Rohingya community. I found myself in December in court with Aung San Suu Kyi. It was quite surreal, actually, her sitting literally two meters from me, and her defending the indefensible, the treatment of a Muslim minority and the mass killing and rape of human beings, basically because they're Muslims. I mean, on a different scale, perhaps, from what happened in the 30s, but nevertheless, the principle is the same: unacceptables who we are going to get rid of one way or another. So I think it really depends on your vantage point. If you're in New York or Cambridge, Mass, or London, yeah, sure, the world looks like it's a lot better. I'm a generation that's lived without war. That is unique for a British and a European, frankly, and that is a remarkable achievement. But that is not the case in other parts of the world.
And did you understand more why Aung San Suu Kyi, who was such a figure of praise and admiration for so many people, why she sacrificed all of that? Was she aware of the folly that she's committed?
I wrote a piece before the Ratline came out where I evoked having sat in the International Court of Justice, just close to her, listening to her, watching her very closely. And what I concluded was that she was rather like Horst Wächter, who we're going to come to shortly. In other words, her father was the founder of what is now the Tatmadaw, the army of Myanmar. He died 2 years before Myanmar gained independence. And she has an absolute love of her father and a reverence of her father. And I think the answer to why she has made the concessions she has, I suspect, lies in the relationship she has with her father, which is, of course, the story of Horst, Otto, and Charlotte Wächter, which we're about to come to.
Which we will now come on to next.
I can't come much beyond that.
I think that's astonishing. Astonishing. Maybe we can talk more later about the evil that parents can do if and how and why children with evil parents, some follow them and others disown them. What do we have here, Philippe?
We have a black and white chrome type photograph. I think we all recognize the man right in the middle, Adolf Hitler. It's taken in 1931 in Munich at the Führerschule, 2 years before Hitler comes to power. If you look at Hitler's face and then move 3 faces to the left as you look at the photograph, you will see a blonde man, and that is Otto Wächter. Otto Wächter was the deputy of Hans Frank. He was the governor of Krakow and then Lemberg. He is the main character in the Ratline with his wife Charlotte. He is at that point 30 years old. He has been a member of the Nazi Party for 8 years. He is about to get married to Charlotte, and he is on the up. And this is his first encounter with Hitler. Interestingly, having known Horst Wächter for 10 years since I wrote East West Street, which is when I met him, this is a photograph I found that Horst did not know. If it was known, it was taken out of the family albums. 5 years after I met Horst, the son of Otto, who you can see here, Horst gave me 10,000 pages of family archives and documents, the letters of Otto and Charlotte, the diaries of Otto and Charlotte, the home photographs of Otto and Charlotte. This photograph was not in it, but it indicates that in 1934, Wächter had already come into the orbit directly of Adolf Hitler. It's not the first time that he met him or was photographed with him, but the photographs had been excluded from the family albums, no doubt, I assume, as a way of minimizing Otto's connections to the top, as he was whitewashed out of this history in the family narrative. It's a story about secrets.
Let's look at the next picture.
Yes, dear Horst, this is the son of Otto. I met him in 2012. He is one of the 6 children of Otto and Charlotte Wächter. I was introduced to him by Nicholas Frank, who's the son of Hans Frank, who was a subject, the 4th character in East West Street, hanged at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and war crimes for the murder of 4 million human beings. Nicholas despises his father. The first time I met him, he showed me a photograph of his father having been hanged. And one day after I met him, he said, you know, you're interested in Lemberg. Would you like to meet the son of the governor of Lemberg, Otto Wächter? His son is Horst. I know him. He's a friend of mine. I said, sure, I'd love to meet him. And I was introduced. This photograph was taken by the wonderful photographer Jill Edelstein, who on a trip for the Financial Times. It's in Schloss Hagenberg, where Horst lives in total impecuniosity. He's at this point just over 70. He's about 75 years old. And as Nicholas said to me, Horst is different from me. He loves his father. He thought he was a liberal and a great guy. And so thus begun a relationship where one thing led to another. I wrote an article in the FT, a profile with the headline, My Father, the Good Nazi. And we then made a film and a podcast series, and he gave me the materials to write the book, The Ratline, which was on the story of his father and his mother, and my effort to understand whether his view of his father was arguable, justifiable, plausible or not.
If you had been alive at the time, what would you have done, Philippe?
Well, if I had been alive at the time in Vienna, I would have been, you know, identified as a Jew and subject to, you know, all sorts of possible ramifications. If I had been alive in England, I hope I would do what I do now in relation to the Rohingya and the Yazidi and agitate. But of course, the world is very different. And it was very interesting, I mentioned the Rohingya case earlier on. I did an event earlier this year in Washington with an American professor and judge, Tom Bergenthal. You might want to read his book. It's called A Lucky Child. Tom Bergenthal became the American judge at the International Court of Justice, but in 1944, he was a child at Auschwitz under the care of Joseph Mengele. And when I told him the story of the Ratline and then the case that I was doing at the International Court on the Rohingya, he said to me, it's incredible, Philippe. Can you imagine if there had been an international court in 1942 and a country had gone to the International Court and said what Hitler is doing to the Jews is illegal, and the court had done what the International Court did in Rohingya and said, yes, it is illegal and you can't kill people or treat people in this way. He said, how amazing. It's the Steven Pinker point. We have made some progress. And I think that that is true. But there was no such court. The British and the Americans created that court basically in 1945. And I think we have a debt of immense gratitude to them for doing it, which brings us again back to that thread of what is going on now. And would they create such a court today? It's hard to imagine Messrs. Johnson and Trump acting like Roosevelt and Truman or Churchill. I mean, they're just cut from a totally different cloth, and they see the world and their own sort of narcissistic place in it in just a very different way. But that's what would have happened. If the world of today existed then, I'd have rushed off to an international court. But of course, there was no such court.
Thank you. We were married by somebody who was a child of Auschwitz. Most of his family were murdered. Let's take the next slide, please. What are we looking at here, Philippe?
Well, let's start with the little boy. We've just looked at the elderly gentleman. That is Horst on the left-hand side. He's 5 years old. It is taken at Tummersbach, which is Zell am See in Austria. He's with his sister Traute, one of his 6 siblings, and to his left, holding him in a rather peculiar way, is his father Otto and his mother Charlotte, herself very able individual, a graphic designer. She designed fabrics. She came to England. She loved England. As you know from having read the book, she had this view that Britain was even more and rightly nationalistic than Germany and Austria. Her diaries are really rather entertaining on that point. And theirs was a love story, and this was where she lived for most of the war, whilst he was engaged in his acts supporting mass killings. So I put the photograph in the book because it shows a sort of happy family scene. And there are 2 things for me that come out of this photograph. One is that in these times of mass killing, normal family life goes on. I'm often asked, do I think Otto Wächter was evil? No, he was indicted for mass murder. He was never caught. He was involved in evil things, but he was also a decent family man who loved his wife and his many girlfriends, loved his children who loved him back. And there was that mundanity of daily life in this beautiful part of the world. I'm sure you've been there, you know what it's like. But there's something else in this photograph which is of importance to me, and that's Charlotte. No one's ever told the story of the role of the spouses. How could Otto Wächter, graduate of Vienna Law School, intellectual, intelligent, highly educated, get involved in such horrors, in such mass murder? And what was the role of the spouse in enabling that to happen? And that's part of the story that I wanted to tell and was able to tell because Horst gave me his mother's diaries from 1929 to 1949. So we have literally a daily record of life together, and you can work out how she became an enabler and in that way complicit in what happened.
Are we reading too much into it when we look at her left hand that looks like an eagle's claw digging into her daughter's, and then his right finger, which is unusually long, which looks like a pistol.
It does. Yes,
probably we are looking at reading too much into that. My goodness, his finger's long though.
Well, let me tell you a story about Charlotte and Traute and why she's holding on to her like this. In 1934, Werther, who was not just anybody, I mean, this is a top table Nazi, was involved in the assassination of the Austrian Chancellor Adolphus. He flees, and 2 years later, Charlotte joins him in Berlin, where he's now in the SS and going up the ladder. And she discovers that he's having an affair, and she's having an affair with a young woman. A few months later, Charlotte falls pregnant with the little girl you can see here, Traute, and she decides to punish her husband by giving her daughter the name of her husband's mistress, which was Traute. As you look at that photograph, imagine the relationship between mother and daughter and what the naming of the daughter in that way says about the mother's relationship to the daughter and the mother's relationship to the husband, and then the daughter's relationship to her parents in due course. As Horst puts it, Traute and Charlotte did not get on later in life.
How much did the wives or mistresses of senior Nazis know about what happens? One thinks of the wife of the commandant at Auschwitz bringing up the children.
Charlotte knew everything. Charlotte knew absolutely everything. I think I'm absolutely clear about that. I've been through all the diaries. She knew exactly what was going on. But more than that, there is an absolute singular moment in 1938. She rushes back to Vienna from Berlin to be there when Hitler arrives and obtains the support of a senior colleague called Globotschnik, who then built Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, to get Otto back in time to be on the Heldenplatz with Hitler. And he gets back and they stand, as she puts it in her diary, 1 meter from the Führer on the balcony of the Heldenplatz. They then leave the balcony, they walk down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs, Otto stops her and says to her, "Now, my darling, what should I do? I've had an offer from Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who's going to be the new Chancellor of Ostmark, Austria as it's called, and he's offered me a job in the government. Or I could just go back to legal practice. We can have a wealthy life. What do you say I should do?" "Go into government," she says. She loved it, and she immediately was swept into a world of balls and cocktails and Bayreuth with the Führer and the Salzburg Festival and a life of plenty, a house in Vienna, a house here in Tummesbach, an extraordinary life of art and parties and wealth. She knew exactly what was going on. She was an enabler.
Next slide, please.
4 years later, what has happened in the interim? VE Day, which we've celebrated the 75th anniversary of quite recently in May of this year. On the 9th of May 1945, Werther is indicted by the Americans and the Poles, chased by the Soviets and the British, and he escapes. Unlike Frank, who is caught, he goes up into the Austrian mountains and he hides for the next 3 years. In the summer of 48, he descends from the mountain, and this photograph is taken that summer near Zell am See. You see Otto inside the room, Charlotte in front of him, Horst on the left, Traute a couple to the right. And this is a photograph as he is beginning to make his way onto the Ratline. He decides that as a hunted man, he is going to make his way to South America. He will go first to Rome, where a religious gentleman, a bishop, will look after him, get him the necessary papers to make his way on the Ratline. Eichmann, Mengele, Barbie and others went, and he will head off to safety in South America. So this photograph is the last photograph of the family together. The cover of the book is actually the last photograph of Otto and Charlotte together, but this is the last one of the family together. He is hunted. He's got a little moustache here. Horst remembers him. He was presented to Horst then as an uncle who had come from South America.
And here it is, if you can see it, the front cover, and I don't know whether that's in focus at all for you.
It is, yes, it is.
So there we are. What is it about the Vatican? Most recently, their refusal to condemn China over the treatment of the Muslim population. why did so many close to the Vatican, inside the Vatican, support these Nazis? Were they showing Christian forgiveness, or was there something more sinister?
A very complicated question, Anthony. I'm not a Vatican expert. My own view at this point, with that caveat, is that it's a complex story. It's not a black and white story. There were some good folk, there were some not so good folk, and the picture is mixed. What happened to Otto is that he had a contact, Bishop Alois Hudal, who he only refers to in his letters home as the religious gentleman. It took us a lot of detective work to work out who he was, but it's the same bishop who helped, Mengele and Barbie and others get out. Was the Austrian bishop in Rome at the Instituto Teutonico and the Anima Institute, and he was on a personal mission. There's some evidence through the work of Gita Sereni that Hudal got a little bit of support from Pius XII, a little bit of money here and there, but there is no evidence that Pius XII, who had been very close to Hudal in the 30s but became estranged from him later on, knew or supported precisely what he was up to. So there is a question as to whether Hudal and those supporting Hudal were off on a frolic on their own, or whether they were actually being supported covertly by the upper echelons. That is not clear, but I do explore it, and I do explore in particular in the Ratline, without giving too much away, how Wächter, who was hunted by the British, the Soviets, the Jews, the Americans, arrived in Rome and found himself in a nest of spies, rather remarkably. And we now know that the Vatican, the Americans, the fascists, the Nazis were all in cahoots in a sort of anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik alliance, and it allowed them to turn a blind eye to certain things. And that story was a bit of a shocker for me, I must say.
Would Wächter have been at the Nuremberg trials? What decided who was put on trial there? How bad did you have to be?
I mean, Wächter was top table bad. I mean,
he would have been
indicted for the mass murder of 500,000 people, so he was as bad as anybody. I've told Horst, my view is pretty clear. As with all his colleagues and all his deputies and others, if he had been caught, he would have been tried and convicted of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And if he'd been tried for genocide, I think genocide also, and he would have been hanged like his boss, Hans Frank. He was as culpable as Hans Frank. He was slightly more smart about it. He didn't keep it in his diaries. He burned his papers. That I've all tracked down. But he was absolutely a top table Nazi, and he would have paid the ultimate price. No question at all.
Next slide.
I love this photograph. It's Otto Wächter. It's his false ID. He has renamed himself, as you can see, Alfredo Reinhardt. He's made himself 9 years younger. The birth date has changed. If you look at it very, very closely, you will see that the stamp over the photograph Comune di Appiano, where it overlays the photograph, has been written in by hand. And this is how he survived in the Vatican. He became Alfredo Reinhardt, living in the Vigna Pia monastery under the protection of Bishop Hudal, hunted by all and sundry, gathering his documents. My aunt went off to the town of Appiano to check with the municipality. It's a fake identity card, one of several that he had.
How did you, and just tell us now, how did you find it?
It's in the family archive that was given to me by Horst, one of the most remarkable family archives I've ever seen, because Charlotta, who obviously loved her husband very dearly and spent the rest of her life trying to sort of repair his damaged reputation, kept documents of this kind. I don't think she would ever expected they would be used in the way that they have been used, but Charlotta kept this.
Next one, please.
So this is one of the diaries, and I wanted to put it in because it gives you a sense of the difficulties that we had with the research. So Otto and Charlotte, while Otto was on the run, he communicated very regularly with his wife. I mean, 10, 15 letters a month, and he kept this diary. And when he died in mysterious circumstances, 3 months after this, he was in possession of the diary, and Charlotte then took it, and it was in the materials. So we now have all of the diaries. And this is the date, the 29th of April, 1949, that he arrives in Rome. And what you see at 1300 hours is the word excel, excellencia, and that is a reference to the religious gentleman never named in any of these papers. At 1500, he meets someone called Marcassini, and we spent a lot of time tracking down who Marcassini was. I don't want to give it all away now, but I wanted to put this photograph in because this was the raw material that we had. I had the extraordinary assistance of Professor Lisa Jardine, her wonderful last PhD student, James Everest, my extraordinary German graduate law student assistant, Leah Mein-Klimst, and 3 or 4 other students who spent hundreds of hours going through these documents. You can see the handwriting is not immediately accessible. This is what we had. This is how we worked out with absolute certainty the final weeks of the life of Otto Wächter. And what we have with this material for the first time is the insides of the Ratline, how it worked, who it met, who they met, who he helped, and so on and so forth. And this was the kind of material, the raw material that we relied on. And it's, you hinted at the beginning, I just love archival material, and it's sort of exciting, but it takes time.
Well, it is. And I just implore everyone listening, looking at this, to as well as reading the books, to look at your own family archives. The thing I enjoy most in life is chairing the National Archive Trust, which is about getting our own unique national archives much better known across. And you sense there, and Antonia Fraser, writing about East West Street, says it's one of the most extraordinary books I have ever read, while John le Carré says it's a monumental achievement, profoundly personal, told with love, anger, and great precision. I like the great precision.
I didn't know you had that position, Anthony. I am the world's greatest supporter, not only of archives, but of archivists, who are the great unstated heroes. In my list of acknowledgements at the back, you'll see there's a lot of references to individual archivists. These are the most remarkable human beings, so diligent, so hardworking, so accessible. What would we be able to do without archivists? I mean, my biggest gratitude to them.
Well, it's wonderful that you highlight their role, and they delight when well-known writers like yourself make the fruits of what they're dealing with day by day known to a wide public. Let's take the next slide.
Well, we've touched on it, we can pass on it briefly. This is the last photograph of Otto and Charlotte. Going is a place. I don't know how you pronounce it. My German, going, I suppose. He's on the run. And again, a la Sebald, the photograph just evokes a lot of imagination, not least the idea of the sound of music. Absolutely. It looks idyllic. I mean, here is a couple in love. Look at the way she's looking at him. He looks relaxed. He's looking a little thin, perhaps. But it's beautiful. It's the Austrian Alps, and you think of, the sound of music, and of course, once you pick away and you know what's going on, a different story emerges. The point is, nothing is ever quite what it seems.
It's almost a teenage first love there. There's something almost innocent, dare I say. I don't think so. Next slide, please.
Well, this is very painful. Horst, the son, was absolutely convinced that his father was a great man and a liberal who never harmed anyone and only tried to do good. So I spent 6.5 years tracking down, because essentially the family archive had been filleted. Any stuff that was damning, I think they tried to cut it out. And so some of the diaries are missing, and I think also some letters are missing. In fact, it wasn't a perfect act of filleting, and I did find some material which was very unhelpful to the claim that the Wächters were decent folk. This is November 1939. It's a dreadful photograph. December 1939. It's a small town in Poland called Bochnia. The day before this photograph was taken, in the archive is a letter from Otto to Wächter, to Charlotte, and he writes, "Marvelous in Krakow, the Vienna Philharmonic came, famous people have come, I am being celebrated, great relations with Frank, a little bit of local difficulty, and tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot." So I went around with 2 of my wonderful Polish students to see whether any photographic image existed of what had happened. It took 6 years to find this and the following photographs. And in another fantastic archive, this one in Warsaw, we eventually found a photo album of which 4 copies were prepared. One for Hitler, one for Goering, and one for the wives of 2 German officers who were shot by partisans. And the killing of the 50 Polish people was Hitler's order of reprisals, illegal under international law, for the killing of the 2 Germans. So I wanted to find the photo album, and eventually I found the photo album. And this is one of the photographs. You see a group of about 25 very young, terrified looking Polish young men. The fellow on the left hasn't been shot. He's just collapsed. And if you can't now, but if you look at the photographs closely, I find this very, very distressing. It's a snowy day in Bochnia, and the next photographs show what happens next.
You can look very close. One of the benefits of these online talks is you can look right up at the photographs.
I mean, if you look at the chap 5th along standing, there's a young man, you home in on his face. It's just the fear etched on his face. I find it very haunting. They know what's about to happen, but they cannot believe that it's about to happen.
Okay, next slide, please.
And here is the moment of actual execution. Again, a very, very distressing image. I put it in the book because I had shown it to Horst, and I describe in the book, and I don't want to give that away now, Horst's reaction to these photographs and his daughter's reaction, the granddaughter of Otto, to these photographs. That becomes a very central aspect of the end of the story. But this is the actual moment of killing, and you see the same people who we've just seen lined up on the right-hand side of the photograph. But maybe we can go to the next one, because just to pause on it, if you look on the far left of the photograph, the far left, if you put the arrow, the first person on the left standing in the middle of the photograph in a black shiny coat, that is Otto Wächter supervising the act of killing, a reprisal, which is a crime under international law. And this was the first act of reprisal. And then you home in. I mean, on this photograph, the far left side, left, the arrow, left, the arrow, and left, the next one, that is Otto Wächter. And from the next photograph, you will see right in the middle of the photograph, Otto Wächter. And there's aspects of this photograph, again, that are very distressing. I mean, the Germans, coats were matters of hierarchy. There's only one in a black leather coat. He is the boss of the show. You see the gentleman next to him immediately, unbelievably carrying a camera with his hands behind him. The points of detail, this is after the act of killing has happened, and it's quite clear who's in control of this moment. And you can imagine, on the one hand, there's a mixed feeling when you finally enter an archive in Warsaw. I went to Warsaw to go to this archive, and you find these images. On the one hand, there's a sense of a hallelujah moment. Yes, here is an actual act of criminality taking place, and Wächter is at the center of it, but also the intense distress of such images, which are very painful. And I pondered long and hard about whether to put them in the book, but I decided I must, because people need to know what happened.
Grisly. Is that the last, Matt?
No, we end with this photograph, the Sala Baglivi. Actually, it's the Sala Baglivi, Baglivi. This is an extraordinary 15th century hospital in Rome, run by the Vatican back in 49. In the material Horst gave me, we got information about the room in which Otto Wächter died. And this is the room in which he died. And I wanted to gain access to the room. I was unable to gain access for 4 years. Eventually, last summer, a friend of mine, the writer Javier Cercas, was invited by the Pope to give a lecture on religion and literature. And while he was there was a funny moment after a cocktail party where Javier said to the cardinal and the bishop who runs the cultural department of the Vatican, were having a conversation. Somehow my name came up. I'd made a podcast series about the Ratline, which some of the people who are watching may have listened to, and Javier mentioned he had his friend Philippe Sands, who wanted to get in this room and find the spot where Wächter died in mysterious circumstances while on the run. And the Irish bishop, wonderful man who I've come to know, said, Philippe Sands, I know that name. He made that podcast, didn't he, for the BBC called The Ratline, not very complimentary about the Vatican, but I loved it, said the bishop. Tell him to come to the Vatican tomorrow and I will help him gain access to the room. And there we are. That's a photograph I took last summer, 70 years to the day, July the 13th, 1949, Wächter died. July the 13th, 2019, the day I took this photograph. And the last painting and frescoes that Wächter will have seen, which become very relevant in the last pages of the book, you can see at the far end of the wall.
And anything more about his death?
Well, he died in mysterious circumstances. Otto's son Horst believes that he was poisoned, either by the Soviets or by Simon Wiesenthal or the Jews. Others believe that he died from an illness called leptospirosis, which he caught while swimming either in the Tiber or on a weekend visit to Castel Gandolfo and Lake Albano to visit an old SS comrade who turned out to be a spy for the Americans and the Soviets. And I will leave it there, but that's part of the last part of the book, trying to work out what happened.
And so read the book there, and we're just going to take in just a couple of minutes the questions. I've been feeding some of them in. Victoria says, I'll just summarize the question. Nuremberg marked the first ever instance of a sovereign state being in the dock. And the question is, how effective or otherwise has this process been in helping the Germans come to terms with the terrible events?
Well, that's right. It was the first time there were international criminal trials. It wasn't so much the state in the dock because it was individuals in the dock. So it was leaders of the state, but it's essentially the same thing. All roads on criminal justice today lead back to the Nuremberg Tribunal, basically created by the British and the Americans, an extraordinary achievement. And I think it did play a role, amongst with other things, in allowing Germany uniquely amongst all countries, I think, to come to terms with what happened. And I think Germany is indeed unique in the world, in history, of being a country that has really sought to engage, and Nuremberg played a part in that. The same cannot be said, I think, of Austria in the same way. And interestingly, a number of the defendants in Nuremberg were Austrians, including Otto Wächter's colleague, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who became the governor of Nazi-occupied Holland and is still today, 75 years later, one of the most hated men in Holland. The book came out in Dutch at the same time as it came out in English, and it's been a sort of bestseller ever since because of Seyss-Inquart. And Seyss-Inquart was hanged at this famous trial at Nuremberg. So I think you cannot overstate the significance of Nuremberg. The 75th anniversary takes place on the 20th of November this year in Courtroom 600, and it's a matter of great honour that the writing of East West Street has caused me to be invited to that event for a conversation with the President of Germany on exactly that question. what we have learned from Nuremberg.
That's very moving. And the final question, a distillation of what Mike and Mikhail, if I got the pronunciation right, and Louise and others are asking, is about how we can retain our optimism about international law. 75 years ago, the war ending, the Nuremberg trials that you write about so movingly. How can you retain your optimism in a world of Rwanda, which is back in the news now, and in the light of the politics that's happening today? Is it cyclical? Where are the great leaders? Where do you look to for hope?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I tend to look. You're the historian, Anthony. I'm not, but I tend to look in my world of international law and the history of international law in very long cycles, not just decades but centuries. And I think if you look at the history of international law over, say, a 400-year period, you see there is a narrative arc. It's a couple of steps forward, a step sideways, a step back. And whenever there is a collapse, a major conflict, the Congress of Vienna, the First War, the Second War, what follows always builds on what came before. That has been the arc of history on justice and international law. I think we may well be heading to another moment of catastrophe, whether it is COVID or nationalism or climate change. But when we emerge from that, and I hope it is not too catastrophic, but I am worried about it, we will build on what came before, and it will be better than what came before. And I think in a broad sense, that is what enables me to be optimistic. Not about next year, not about next decade, but 50 years and 100 years. And that's the way I look at history. And
last question, do we need a strong United Nations? We have a UN centre here at the university. Do we need a strong commitment to multilateralism to make international law work? And without that, it won't.
Well, we need something. I mean, there is a move now by the British and the American leadership to basically tear down the 1945 moment and to replace the multilateral world with a bilateral world. That is the link between Brexit and Trump. That is the point of connection. And that's why what has happened in Britain over the last 48 hours is so significant. It is a confirmation that Britain would like to shred the order that it created in 1945. And we see that also in relation to a diminishing commitment to the International Court, to the United Nations, but other countries will fill that void. And what is remarkable is if you look back and go back to 1945, could we have imagined on the closing day of the Nuremberg trial, when 22 defendants have just met their fate, 10 of them executed, the rest either acquitted or given sentences of imprisonment, that Germany would become 75 years later the flag carrier for the rule of law and the bastion of liberal democracy, and Britain and the United States would find themselves in the position they are in now. And of course, nothing is ever black and white. We hear a lot of negative things, for example, about China. But interestingly, when it comes to the rule of law and multilateralism in the economic field, the World Trade Organization, investor protections, and so on and so forth, China has emerged as the leader. And so I think there is a rejigging taking place now. What I want is for Britain and the United States to be back at the top table. I think the first thing for that to happen is that Donald Trump has to go. If he doesn't go, I think we are in for an absolutely torrid time. And I can even imagine the United States, now having left the World Health Organization, leaving the United Nations in a second Trump administration.
Well, what a moment to have your talk, and what a resounding, passionate cry that was for the importance of law, the civilizing impact of law, and a study of history. It's been a great pleasure and thrill to have you, Philippe, talking to us tonight. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you very much. And
thank you, Anthony, and thank you, a wonderful audience, and for the questions.